What's up, Power Painters? This is Taylor Payton of TayPayArt.com and PowerPainters.org coming to you today with another Power Painters tutorial. Now, in this tutorial, I'm just going in and making a quick blurred background, sort of priming the canvas, if you will. And sometimes I like to envision as though I'm actually working with a real physical canvas, with a real surface that is layered, because you're laying paint on top of paint in order to create these pieces that we're working on. And I want to make sure that I kind of remind myself of that from time to time. If you're doing your paintings or whatever, and it's a tendency to not really feel the connection with the medium because it's digital, especially if you've never painted traditionally. But I highly recommend just trying to get that feeling that when you're making layers, when you're building layers up, that way you can feel the forms a lot more, you can understand your textures better, and you get a more traditional sort of look to your work. And I personally think that oil painting has been around. I know oil painting has been around for hundreds of years, as opposed to digital painting, which is a relatively new advent into the world of art. So we want to take the best aspects of oil painting to the digital painting frontier, or at least that's one thing I like to do quite frequently. I don't usually polish my images like crazy, like use the very clean aspects of digital. I like to sort of keep things a little rough, a little, loose around the edges, and have some texture and some grit, just because I feel like I can resonate better with that. Although there are some really gorgeous artworks that are fairly well rendered, and it all depends on what sort of style or what sort of workflow you're using or going for. So now you see me just sort of going in, and once I've laid in my figure, I turn down all the opacities and layers and just start painting a new version of that figure. It's something you've seen me do time and time again on this channel, but I will reiterate for those of you who are new. Basically, you want to not go with your very first drawing, and that's usually because it's not going to be the best one. You want to use it as a basis to elaborate upon. And in quicker works like this, usually I go with only two, but in some of my longer stuff, I might redraw it, up to 6 times before laying in too much paint. So that iterative drawing, that step-by-step drawing is a huge key when it comes to art and developing a higher quality finish, regardless of whether you're going for a very clean finish or maybe a more, rough, painterly finish. Once I have my sketch laid in, I really like to go ahead and start rocking in some light. The background works fairly well as sort of that medium tone, and so you see me just go in with some orangish underlight, some sort of yellow top light. It's not quite yellow, it's more of like a gray yellow, not completely saturated, because if I have really saturated orange like I do on the bottom, and I would go with a color that's also really rich on for the top light as well, that would be kind of overwhelming visually and it would compete a little too much. Notice I also have diffused the light on the bottom, and the light on the bottom is a lot more broad and orange, and the forms are being carved a lot softer, whereas the light on top is a lot more succinct and sharper, and the marks are smaller, because that's the way I'm defining the forms on top versus the way I'm defining the forms on bottom. So I'm seeing two light sources here and using them to carve the forms of the figure. And this is something you want to think about quite frequently once you have your figure laid in or drawn in. It's where's the light coming from, what light sources are there, what are the color of those light sources, how are they going to affect the transition of form and shadow. Are they going to raise the value because they're hitting the form, or is the value going to get lower because it's in the shadow area? And this is the kind of stuff that I like to think about all the time, because I feel that I just have these helpful mental models that I've learned from a lot of master painters and master artists in general, reading Andrew Loomis books and Harold Speed books and Vanderpool, all these guys. I'll link to some of them in the description, because these are fantastic resources. But basically, I'm just hinting at the fundamentals and having the right questions give you the most pertinent answers, so you can take the proper actions on the canvas and not noodle around and create something that's sort of nebulous and messy. Because the most helpful thing for me when it came to improving my art was to actually have the sort of not only a proper process for walking step by step through an image and developing my intuition by just doing it a lot, but also having the right ideas when it came to parsing fundamentals and asking myself the right questions, like I stated earlier. So, as you can see, I'm just trying to figure out the head now. The pose in and of itself, I was not a fan of because he looks sort of scared, and there's no reason for that in the narrative. The question would be like, what is he scared of? What is off the screen? And so I have to end up editing his facial design as well as his hand positioning and the narrative and the pose just because I didn't think it all the way through before I started painting. First, I'm like, oh, he's gonna be lava face, and there's like a red light source or an orange light source coming from his face, but I end up sort of toning that back as well, settling on a different countenance because I just wasn't feeling any of these things, and that's why you want to develop your intuition because you'll get a feeling of whether something's working or not, and you'll know to sort of pivot and change it before you get too far down any particular rabbit hole during the process. Yeah, my last video I talked about warm ups, and this was another warm up of another day that I recorded. It was mostly to figure out lighting, and once again, to just keep refining that process of having, the initial sketch, turning down the opacity, and then moving forward with a more clear idea. And every time I do that, I get, strong results, much stronger than if I just blast straight through something. I never do that anymore unless it's just like a thumbnail or a really tiny piece that I'm going to elaborate upon in a bigger setting. It's like if a musician only played a scale once and then tried to use it in a song, they'd be really sloppy most likely because that scale isn't innate. It's not in your muscle memory. It's not in your nervous system, and you're going to not play it with as much confidence, with as much bravado. You're going to be sort of sloppy and unsure, and that's the same way when it comes to work or artwork rather. So just something to keep in mind is to always just keep iterating upon your ideas, even if it's in the same session because it's a huge game changer. Now I'm going in with some color dodge because who doesn't love color dodge? It's a really fun layer mode. And speaking of layer modes, I'm gonna make a tutorial on those probably within the next week or so. But color dodge just basically uses color and light to amplify the values and sort of burst them up with very glowy effects. I recommend trying the layer out if you haven't already. One thing you saw me just do there is I took a piece of my figure and I sort of laid it over his face because I was basically, taking a whole nother layer off of him and grafting it on to the head because I wasn't liking the previous head, and so I'm designing a new face based off of the graft that I did. And this is a technique, once again, that'll save you a lot of time and one that I use quite a bit because it's just so economic. I mean, you have the texture already there, you have the same values, the same colors, so of course it's going to implement well. It's like, when people take a certain bit of skin from one area of their bodies and place it on another area, there's not going to be any rejection typically because the doctor knows that the cells are going to work together. And I think of that sort of when I'm painting. I want to make sure that things are harmonizing if I'm going to be taking from one part and transposing it to another. Talking about the design a little bit, I was unsure before, but as I proceeded, I wanted him to have sort of a battery head. So like you think of like a Duracell battery or whatever, and it's got a copper top on top of it, and I imagine him as sort of an elemental or an energy being, and maybe an eidolon. I think that's the Greek word for a very similar concept. So just having this glowing dude who right now looks scared because of the pose. I fixed that up in a second, but since it's sort of a character feature, I wanted his facial region to be interesting. He's got a third eye, he's got two normal eyes, he's got sort of a plated face, and I imagine like he's either some sort of other dimensional or extra dimensional entity, or something that maybe somebody summoned, and now he's here to do battle. And you'll see that I add a sword here, just by kind of going in with the lasso tool and making sure that I have some nice crisp edges, and I use the same colors that I have in the composition already. And it all just tends to kind of work out because I had enough here to work with in my initial pose so that I could actually finish it up, this speed paint, this warm up, and learned a lot about lighting, and I got an interesting design and a reasonable piece out of it. Um, Here's something I do quite a bit. I didn't really care for how cropped the canvas was, so I had to extend it a little bit just so he has a little more breathing room for the sword and for his hand to do something a little different. So just quickly extend the canvas, do a quick copy merge, copy paste, and just drag it over with the transform tool. A lot of really cool things you can do in Photoshop. Like trying to put another piece of canvas together, if this was a traditional painting, would have been just awful, just absolutely terrible. But yeah, as we come to the end of this video, I'll just recap the fundamentals real quick and what I was sort of trying to do here. So basically, we just had running through a process again so that it gets more and more integrated into the nervous system. We have figuring out a lighting scenario with less saturated lights on top that are sharper and more about rim light, more diffuse lights on the bottom that are softer and more about fill light, and just trying to get a mood, an atmosphere, a character design down fairly quickly in a fairly succinct way. So yeah, thank you for watching. I hope you learned a trick or two, using the color dodge layers or this process. And if you make something you want to show me, feel free to drop a link in the comments, or find me at on Tumblr or Twitter or Facebook. I got Power Painters accounts everywhere. So thank you for watching. Thanks for your support. If you want to know more about the fundamentals I spoke of, like values, edges, having a strong drawing, lighting setups, things like that, you can check out some of the Power Painters courses, which are in the description box as well, available on Gumroad, tapeart.com, and CubeBrush. Just lots of places to grab those if you are interested. Lastly, here I am dropping in a Gaussian blur after doing Command Alt Shift E or Control Alt Shift E if you're on PC, and that just lets me copy merge everything into a new layer, do a big Gaussian blur, and then use a soft brush to eliminate all the noise in the background so we really focus on the character. It's like sort of a fake depth of field effect. That's it for this painting, and I hope you enjoyed it. Happy painting, and I will see you in the next video, Power Painters. Thanks for 9K subs and all your support, and here's the final image. Take care.